Hi, everyone, and welcome. First, we're going to start our timer. Make sure we finish on time. Welcome to HTV, and I'm going to start now Crash Course in Jewish History, my essential series that I do if we were live in Jerusalem, but since we can't do that, we'll be Zooming it. I hope you like my background picture. You can actually see this is the old city walls during the height of Corona lockdown. Even Jaffa Gate, you can see in back of me over there, is completely closed, and there's no people anywhere. Thank God. It's much busier now. That's an old picture from about a month and a half ago. But we're going to be doing an overview of Jewish history, and the first few classes that I want to do are basically the introduction. You got to always, you know, as I say, see the forest through the trees. Like when you do a jigsaw puzzle, first you do the border and then you fit the pieces in. So before we go into the details, we want to spend some time outlining the big picture. So we're going to start with the introduction. It'll probably take in half-hour segments, at least 3 segments, just to finish the introduction. You know, I always say I hate, we'll have some visual aids also as we go on. But we'll get to those in a few minutes. I always say I hate using the term history when I teach history, because as soon as I say the word history, people think of subject in a school. And nothing turns you off to learning like making it a subject in a school, which is why my high school yearbook quote is the quote from Mark Twain: "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." And the older I get, the more I appreciate that almost everything I learned in school, I have to say, besides the basics, is long since disappeared, because we associate history with, you know, memorizing names, dates, places. You write it on the exam and then you forget it. That is not the reason we need to learn history. The reason we want to learn history, I think, was best stated by the Spanish-American writer philosopher George Santayana, who wrote in the basically the 1950s. It's a quote that you're probably all familiar with. He said, "Those who don't learn from the past are destined to repeat it." And it's based on an idea that human nature is basically the same. And we tend to do the same stupid things over and over again. I think it's Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Prize-winning author of blessed memory. He said, if there's one thing we learn from history, it's we don't learn from history. At least that's one thing we learn. But as to why we need to learn history in general, and specifically Jewish history, goes back to a much more important point. And to understand that point, we have to first understand what is the most important idea the Jewish people gave the world, besides guilt, bagels, junk bonds, leverage buyouts, Einstein, Marx, Freud, 22% of all the Nobel Prizes since 1901, 24% of the Fields Medals in mathematics, 25% of the Forbes list of the wealthiest people on the planet Earth. And the answer is one God. One God, brought to you by the Jewish people. Because the idea of one God and one absolute standard of morality has huge implications for human history. One God also has huge implications for a lot of things besides history, also morality. The first book I wrote, World Perfect, Jewish Impact on Civilization, great book, by the way, ask my mother, she'll tell you, deals with the impact of monotheism on morality. You can watch on my website, kenspiro.com. I do a whole presentation on this topic. But one God has huge implications for history, because one thing we understand about God is that he is the creator, sustainer, and supervisor, that God knows and controls everything. It's a fundamental belief in Judaism. We're not just stumbling through a series of trends and events that have no beginning, no end, and no point. It's a fundamental belief in Judaism that history is a controlled process leading to a destination. Simply put, we're all in a story. Now, I don't know about you, but if someone walked up to me in the street, you know, with a microphone and said, hey, you know, you're in a story, you're in a movie, like, what would you ask them? What would be the first question out of your mouth? I mean, I would ask, like, what is this, like a documentary, a news story, is it an action movie? And like, what's my role in the story? I'm a lead actor, a supporting actor, a bit part, and like, where are we? Is it the beginning, the middle, the end, you know? So what I want to do is before we get into the details, is deal with answering those big questions of Jewish worldview. What does Judaism say is the purpose of creation? What's the Jewish people's role in the story? How long does it take? Where are we in the story? And interestingly enough, to deal with an interesting philosophical question, are we just like scripted into the story, like an author or director puts the actors or the character in a book? Or do we get to interact with the author and decide how the story turns out? So let's begin at the beginning. And I want to call up here, let's do some screen sharing here. Hopefully this will work much better than my last attempt at it. There we are, okay. Here we go. Let's enlarge that. Let's call it the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so let's begin at the beginning. I mean, you can sort of see the answers in front of you already, but they're supposed to be highlighted and appear in a minute. But when does time begin in Judaism? I mean, time begins with the Big Bang. In terms of the creation narrative, that's the first sentences. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Before there's a physical universe, there's no time, because what is time a measure of? Time's a measure of change. Before there's a physical universe, there is nothing there and there's nothing to measure it with. So time may begin with the creation of the universe, but when do we start keeping time from in Judaism? Now, a lot of people would jump in and say, oh, we start keeping time from that moment. But the reality is that's not the case. The reality is we start keeping time from not day 1 of creation, but day 6 of creation. What happens on day 6? Day 6 is the creation of human beings, Adam and Eve. Now, why do we start with day 6 and not day 1? And since we're talking about movies, I like to use a movie analogy to explain this. A Hollywood movie director, like Quentin Tarantino, Steven Spielberg, the Coen brothers, these guys, they don't wake up in the morning, grab a cell phone and say, hey guys, grab some equipment. We're going to shoot a major motion picture today. Anyone who knows how a movie's made knows that there's a tremendous amount of pre-production. You got scripting, casting, special effects, makeup, lighting, costuming. So too God, the ultimate producer director. He spends a long time creating, like setting the stage. Literally in terms of, we have, I know Dr. Schroeder is teaching, and he's also teaching on HTV. Dr. Schroeder is a double PhD in nuclear physics and oceanography. He's written at least 4 books on science and Torah. He does an amazing job of crunching, literally 13 billion years down into the 6 days of time. By the way, and watch Dr. Schroeder for this. We had the science before science had the science. It's actually pretty cool. It fits beautifully. But that's a separate class. We're not going to get into that. But we don't start from day 1, which is the Big Bang. We start from day 6. Day 6 is the creation of human beings. And going to the movie analogy, we now understand why. Because a director may take literally weeks, months, or years to set the stage, but you don't start filming until the actors come on the set. In this case, day 6. What happens in day 6? Creation of human beings. What's the lesson we learned from that? Just like in a movie, you don't start filming till the actors come on. We don't start filming until our story, the ultimate story, his story, until human beings show up. And just like in a movie, the camera is on the actors when we start the movie, so too, the lesson we learned, big lesson number 1, is the focus of creation is us. Focus of creation is us. But just like in a movie, when the director finally says action, the actor doesn't just stand there and go, what? I got to do something? He's got lines. We have lines also. What are our lines? What I'm asking is actually the biggest question there is. What's the question I'm asking? Why are we here? What's the purpose of creation? What's it all about? I ask this question to thousands of people a year, and most people look back at me with a completely blank stare. The biggest question there is. When I ask religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, most of them will give me one of 2 answers. We're here to either serve God, or we're here to learn Torah and do mitzvot. Learn Torah and do the commandments. Now, Torah and mitzvot, by the way, super important, but they're a means to an end. That, by the way, is a huge point. I think of the entire Jewish world, and especially a religious world, could make that paradigm shift that Torah and mitzvot are means to an end, and not the ends, that we have a different religious Jewish world and a different world altogether. But also serving God. It's a figure of speech, but you can't really do anything for God because God's infinite. You can't do anything for infinity. It's like having an uncle with an infinite bank account. He can give us anything and everything, but we can't give him anything back. We can only take. Lopsided relationship. And by the way, for every relationship we have with God, which is incomprehensible on a certain level because he's infinite, there's a human relationship that parallels it. So what does that relationship sound like? Where one side can only take, the other side can give, besides your relationship with the IRS? And the answer is, and a lot of people would say now, parent to child. That's correct, but I need to be more specific because every human being is someone's child. And once you're past a certain age, you can actually give things to your parents. You could be useful. You could take the garbage out. What I'm looking for, the answer I'm looking for is mother to a newborn. Like, what could you do for your mother when you were a week old? Isn't it amazing how easy it was to impress your mother? When you're a week old, you drooled and she got excited. Try coming back from, a semester at university. Hey, Mom, look what I learned. She won't be impressed. So Judaism teaches that the purpose of creation is pleasure. God wants to give us. And by the way, there's many different levels of pleasure. Like a mother wants to give a child, so too God, the ultimate parent, wants to give us, every one of us individually and collectively. He wants to give us stuff. But there's different kinds of stuff. There's different levels of pleasure. What I'm explaining now is a micro version of what is one of the great classes of my Rosh Yeshiva, the founder of Eshet Torah, Rabbi Noach Weinberg, of blessed memory. It's called the 5 Levels of Pleasure, and it is actually a short version of what Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, in his brilliant book, Mesilat Yesharim, explains. He wrote this book in the 18th century. But if you want to do that actual class, it's well worth taking the time, and maybe it's going to be on HTV. I would highly recommend doing the proper version of the 5 Levels of Pleasure class, because it's like being a human being 101 class. But Judaism teaches that not all pleasures are the same. Like, not all stuff is the same. Getting a pen is not like getting a Ferrari. But in terms of pleasure, the lowest level of pleasure is physical pleasure, like eating an ice cream. It's a pleasure. It's not that meaningful. It's also high in calories. The level above, and remember the pleasure scale, like the Richter scale, is, by the way, people hear this whole concept, the purpose of creation is pleasure. That's what Judaism's about. No way. Judaism's about like minutia and halacha, and we're confused. We think the opposite of pain is pleasure. The opposite of pain is actually comfort, no pain. Pain and pleasure go together, like we say in sports. No pain, no gain. The more you work for something, the more you sweat for it, the more meaningful it is, which is why, like, winning your 12-year-old local Little League championship is not like winning the World Series, especially with Chicago Cubs fan. It only happens like once every century. I'm a Yankees fan from New York. I had to get that in. But there are different levels of pleasure. They're not all the same. Lowest level pleasure, like I said, physical pleasure. One level up is love, a lot more work, but a lot greater pleasure. I'm going to skip the intermediate levels because it's not part of this class. But highest level pleasure, Judaism says, nothing comes close. The greatest pleasure is connection to God. Transcendence, dveikut, as we say in Hebrew. And all the whole lifetimes of lower level pleasures doesn't begin to equal 1 minute of your soul's direct connection to that infinite light that is God. And that's what the Garden of Eden was supposed to be about. This perfect environment where everything is taken care of, nothing to do, no work, no deadline, no carpool, no term paper, no calling the plumber, going to the store. Everything is taken care of. And we're 100% free to focus all of our time and our energy on what our soul really wants, which is transcendence. White ice cream when you can have transcendence. Should have been the shortest, most straightforward story, but puts us in this perfect environment, takes care of everything, and we live happily ever after, building that relationship with God. But something went really, really wrong. I mean, the world is very far from perfect today. And think about it. According to the pain is the pleasure, and the highest level of pleasure is relationship with God. What's the hardest thing to build and maintain in this world? And the answer is relationship with God. By the way, the early narrative of the Bible, once you get past the creation story, is exactly about this point. Human beings saying, I know God is out there, but it's so hard to have a relationship with an infinite, invisible being. He's not like you can't go out to Starbucks with God, sit across from him and have a latte, that kind of thing. And by the way, we appreciate this point. Anyone who prays daily like religious Jews do appreciates exactly this point. You take your 3 steps back, you take your 3 steps forward, you bow, the words start to go on autopilot, and you step back again a few minutes later, and you don't even remember if you said them or not. And if, for any of you who are observant and have prayed, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Don't say it never happened to you. It happens to all of us because it's really hard to have that relationship. And the early narrative of the Bible, basically beginning with Adam making the mistake of first eating from the tree of knowledge and then blaming his wife for it. That was a big mistake. She made me do it. Is all about humanity losing that connection because people said it's too hard to have a relationship with God. But think about it. We've all had moments of awe. Every one of us, I'm sure, has had a moment of awe. Like, whoa, amazing. That is so beautiful. Where are we when we have those moments of awe? We're almost always outside. I'm almost always looking at nature, like a beautiful sunset, the stars at night, the Grand Canyon, something like that. I say it's amazing to look at the Grand Canyon. So people said, you know, I see all the amazing things God created. I'll have a relationship with those as a way of indirectly connecting to the Creator himself. But what happened, Judaism teaches? People just forgot about God and ended up worshiping the forces in nature. The whole relationship is lost. That's probably the worst thing you can do in this world. You can't help God. You can't hurt God. I mean, the first of the 10 commandments, think about it, the big 10, there's 613, but those big 10 that we're all more familiar with is Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I'm the Lord your God. Like, you know, that's it. That's the nature of reality. There's nothing really on a certain level besides God. God is reality. The second of the big 10 even comes before thou shalt not forget to call your mother, which is honoring your parents, which is don't worship anything else. There is nothing else. Okay, you can't help God, you can't hurt God. But to worship something else besides God is to destroy yourself. It's to have like an invisible spouse. You're destroying the most basic, fundamental, important relationship you have. But that's what human beings did. They said, I don't see God himself, but I see the incredible things he created. I'll have a relationship with those as a way of indirectly having that relationship with God. But what happened after a while was the relationship with God was lost, and people just ended up exactly doing the worst thing they could do, which is worshiping the forces in nature. And those things became God. So the whole purpose of creation is dropped. Humanity fumbles the ball. And as I explained in my World Perfect book, there is very clearly, historically proven, a direct connection between our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. The relationship with God is lost, and the relationship with humanity unravels into immorality, lawlessness, and violence. The world goes into a decline. It's interesting, the word used in the book of Genesis is what was the world full of at that time? The word used is Hamas, which means like violence and lawlessness. I wonder if those guys in Gaza who run that terrorist organization knew that when they decided to call their organization Hamas. Or maybe they decided to call like Goldstein, Schwartz, and Feingold on Madison Avenue and say, can you give us a name for a terrorist organization that's going to launch missiles randomly at civilian targets across a border? Anyway, the world goes into decline. In the middle, God tries to salvage it all. That whole purpose is lost. Idolatry creeps in. God tries to salvage it with the flood story, which we read almost like a little fairy tale. We have Noah's Ark. We got the boat. It's really, getting the animals on. We have these big questions like, how did Noah know a male mosquito from a female mosquito? But it's actually a very heavy story. God says, use the world correctly or lose it. He wipes out the world, sparing only one guy, Noah, and his family, hoping that they will repopulate the world with people who have a relationship with him. Is Noah successful? No. He's great enough to save himself, but not proactive enough to save the world. So the world continues to decline until it gets to the Tower of Babel story. And what's the plot of the Tower of Babel story? Humanity unites, but for all the wrong reasons. What do we call that today? General Assembly of the United Nations, world's most destructive organization. Today they unite to condemn Israel obsessively. Back then they unite to rebel against God. And God's thinking, game over, I give up. I created the universe with the Big Bang, maybe we'll just have the big crunch. We'll nuke the universe back to nothing, retry it again, and maybe next time people will get it right. But thank God, along comes one human being, and this is the ultimate power of one story. One human being's ability to change the whole course of human history. Who's that person I'm talking about? I think he's the greatest intellectual idealist of all time. And that guy is Abraham. And Abraham is great for two reasons. In a world that has totally lost connection with God, Abraham is a radically transformative, free-thinking super genius who's able to think outside the box and come to the realization that there's one infinite being out there, that knows and controls everything, one source of morality. But imagine being the only person to believe in a radically transformative, completely unacceptable idea that most people would kill you for just whispering. And that's the greatness of Abraham. He says, I don't care what anyone thinks. I want truth regardless of consequences. I choose to live and, if necessary, to die for the reality of God. Now, by the way, Abraham knows much better than we know. You don't live for God. You don't die for God. You don't do anything for God. But without that relationship, we're doomed. We're going to eat each other alive. So he is going to commit himself to a unique mission in this world, which is what this whole chosen people thing's about. And you have to be able to explain this. It's the most fundamental understanding of what the Jewish people's about. And the way I explain chosen people simply is like this. Abraham says to God, God, I choose you. I choose to dedicate my life and the life of my descendants to one mission, to being the people whose job it is to teach humanity about the reality of you and the values that come from relationship with you. And God says to Abraham back, Abraham, you're choosing me, I choose you back, you and your descendants. What are we chosen for? We're not chosen for privilege, we're chosen for responsibility. What's the responsibility? The term the Jewish world loves to use, overuse, and sometimes misuse is tikkun olam, which translates to fix the world. How's that for a responsibility? A little bigger than save the whales? We're the God Squad. Our job is to be the nation whose job it is to get humanity back to this connection, back to this highest level of relationship. By the way, the real job of the Jewish people is really Kiddush Hashem, which is to live and act in a way that inspires other people. People are supposed to look at us and say, look at those Jews, look at how they live, look at how their families, their marriages, their relationships, their community, how they do business, what's their secret? Our job is to get humanity back to the highest moral, spiritual level humanly possible. So now we have like basically a plot rewrite to get us back to the garden, so to speak. The original job was humanity hangs out in the garden building relationship with God, but they fumbled it. They dropped the ball. Abraham picks it up and runs with it. The new plot of history is humanity returns to God, Jewish people lead the way. And this is the plot not just of Jewish history, but of all of human history. And I always tell my students that we have to start looking at the world with Jewish lenses and Jewish software, like looking at a different wavelength of the electromagnetic spectrum. Visible light just shows us a little bit of it. We look at that, ultraviolet, infrared, gamma ray, that kind of stuff. Infrared, you see heat, the world looks very different. If we start to look at history with Jewish lenses and Jewish software, all the seemingly disconnected events of Jewish history start to fit together and make sense. And history starts to become empirical. Just like science. There are laws of cause and effect in this, just like there are rules in science. We do X, Y will happen. It's incredibly transformative to start looking at it this way. So humanity returns to God, Jewish people lead the way, becomes the plot of the story. And I know, and I've mentioned this many times. I once said this in a class years ago, and a guy said to me, Rabbi, wait, time out. He said, Rabbi, how many people are in the world? And I said, over 7.3 billion. He goes, Rabbi, how many Jews are in the world? And amazing, people think there are a lot more Jews in the world than there really are. Maybe we'll get to that topic at a later date, the disproportionate impact we have on the world. But I said, there's like 14 or so million Jews in the world. He said, Rabbi, what percentage of the world is Jewish? And I said, percentage of the world is Jewish? It is. Jews are like 0.1%, 0.2% of the world's population. Microscopically small percentage of the world is Jewish. He said, you're telling me Jews aren't even 1% of the world's population, but the plot of human history is humanity returns to God, Jewish people lead the way. Aren't you being a little bit like egocentric here? And I said, you know what? You're asking the question really obnoxiously, but I can give you any number of examples that clearly illustrate that we, the Jewish people, play, despite our teeny tiny size, a disproportionate role in human history because of the decisions that Abraham made thousands of years ago. And the first example I used to illustrate this is I call it the infantry example. When an infantry unit goes out, and I was a combat infantry unit in the IDF. It was so long ago, I think Joshua was our commanding officer. I had all my kids, a bunch of my kids were also in different combat units in the Army. Paratroopers, Golani, Caracal. When we would go out on patrol, we would go 2 by 2 with one guy in the front. Every army in the world does this, not just the Israeli army. And I said, the guy in the front is called, and I once said that, and the guy yells out, dead! I said, he's not called dead, he's called the point man. But why do people think sometimes he's dead? Because that point man is a position of tremendous responsibility. This guy is leading the way. I mean, he's looking for the minefields and the ambushes. The unit is following him. But if you run into trouble, he's going to get it first. And I said, that's exactly the situation of the Jewish people. When humanity fumbled the ball and Abraham picked it up and ran with it, we became the point nation of history. And I hate to do what is an entire class in literally 1 minute, but what I'm telling you now not only illustrates that the Jewish people, despite our teeny tiny size, plays a huge role, but it explains the real cause of what all anti-Semitism is about. You know, if you study the history of anti-Semitism, we've been accused of a lot of things. You know, poisoning wells, kidnapping Christian babies, using their blood to bake matzah, you know, controlling the world's economy, seismic activity, solar flares. We trigger tsunamis in Southeast Asia to drown Indonesia with tidal waves, release sharks into the Red Sea to destroy Egyptian tourism. Last year, Iran accused Israel of stealing its cloud cover. All those excuses aside, the one true cause of anti-Semitism is we have a unique role to play in this world. We are always out in front. When evil comes into the world, and you can test like this like gravity, if Jews are around, they will be the first target. They always come after us. It starts with us, but it spreads to everyone else. And this is one example where we can begin to see that despite our teeny tiny size, the world will focus on us, and evil will always target us first, because it's a recognition that we play a very central role. We may not be physically large, but we play a big role in this story. Okay, so we're running out of time here, so I'm going to just summarize quickly what we've looked at, and then in the next class that we're going to do tomorrow, we're going to look at one more example and then focus on the whole time frame. But to just put it all together, Judaism teaches that the purpose of creation is relationship with God. Okay, that's the highest level. The purpose of creation is the focus of creation is human beings. The purpose of creation is pleasure, and the highest level pleasure is relationship with God. Humanity blows it. Okay, and fumbles the ball, so to speak, degenerates into idolatry. Abraham picks up that ball, so to speak, and runs with it. So the national historic mission of the Jewish people will be to reconnect humanity back to this idea of relationship with God. And from Abraham onward, the Jewish people will play a central role in that story, despite our teeny size. And that is the explanation why humanity is always focusing and always picking on us. So we touched on big point number 1, that we're in the story and the Jewish people's role in the story. What we're going to do when we pick up is get to the next part of the introduction and discuss how long the story takes, and also, are we just scripted in, or do we get a chance to actually interact with the director, the author, and decide how that story takes place. So guys, thanks for joining us on the first part of the introduction and crash course on HTV. You're welcome to follow us on Facebook, leave comments, and like us as you see fit. And we will get back to the story soon, back tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your day, and Shavua Tov.